Welcome to the Leeds Church Institute podcast. LCI is a faith-based organisation for lifelong learning. We work through events, publications, social media and a not-for-profit business.
Hello, I'm Helen Reid, Director of Leeds Church Institute. Today I'm also here in my other role as a clergy spouse because we've chosen for you to come here to St Chad's because we thought this was a really good environment for a Saturday afternoon event, perhaps more so than Leeds Church Institute. I think it's best part of a year since we heard that Tom was going to be in the UK. I'm delighted that he's made time to come up to Leeds. He's been at Oxford and lots of other places. If you'd like to know, we've had him at the university working hard and we've had a discussion group on a Thursday evening. For this event, I felt Leeds Church Institute, we were really excited by the fact that Tom talks about making photos and about celebrating God's creation and seeing photography as theology. So some of you, I think, will have seen the article that he wrote that was in our last City Theology magazine, and that was to encourage people to come. I think learning through visual things, sometimes we can learn even more perhaps than we always just stick with words. So we're delighted that Tom's going to talk today about photography and spirituality. We've primed him, you might get a few tips about taking photographs, a few tips about hiking, and lots about spirituality and nature. Big welcome to Tom, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Helen and Tom. And thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon. Helen is right. I would like for this to be kind of conversational. I can sort of talk myself, but I already know what I think, and I'd like to hear what you think. It's more fun for me. So my kind of goal today is to walk through and talk about the way I think about God when I'm in the natural world. Most of the photographs you see today will be ones that I took in my state of Idaho, but there are some other photographs from other places, and I even put in, just for you all, a photo I took in Scotland a few years ago. So bring a little UK to you. So basically, at the very core of my quest to spend time in the natural world and to think about what it means to love God and love creation has kind of morphed into also figuring out what it means to make art and thinking about visions of the natural world that I think describe the kind of views I have about God. And what I find is that I bring to the natural world certain ideas, and I see the world based on those ideas, and yet the natural world changes some of those ideas. So it's not entirely what the world does to me or what I do about seeing the world. There's this kind of ongoing conversation. I use hiking and photography to think about how God is revealed in creation. I'm a person who believes in God. I'm a Christian. I'm a professor. I'm also an ordained elder. So I think from a Christian kind of perspective. And as I think about what it means to be a Christian and think about God, I often think about sort of the major ways people think we know something about God. And the first, at least in my tradition, is the Bible. But also, we think about God being revealed in our community. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, God is there. So the church is a way. But less often, people think about the revelation of God in nature. And in fact, there's a tradition that talks about the 2 books of God's creation, or God's revelation. And that is the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And so the kinds of things I want to talk about today is God's revelation in this book of nature. All the photographs you see are ones I have made, and I spend a lot of time hiking in the outdoors. In fact, my wife she jokes about how much time I'm hiking. I'm at the place now where my 3 daughters are out of the house, and my wife is a school teacher, so she spends Sunday afternoons after church usually grading, and I spend Sunday afternoons out making photographs. But I also spend a lot of my summers planning big, long hikes. I think God is revealed through a variety of ways, but especially through these creatures such as this young owl. This is a photograph I made. This owl was probably this high in a tree. There were two of them. And the mother owl was up above me, snapping her beak at me, trying to threaten me. And sometimes it's really difficult to make a photograph. Other times it's super easy. I just sort of walked up there and started taking photographs like this. And when I look at the eyes of creatures like this, I begin to think about the ways in which humans and animals share some similarities. And one of the things I want to do today is talk more about that. Paul says, what can be known about God has been revealed in creation. In fact, he says, since the beginning of the world, God's eternal power and nature have been, it's interesting how he says this in the book of Romans. He says, have been clearly seen through that which is made. I'm not sure it's always clearly seen, but he says you look at creation, and at least from the perspective of faith, you say it's clear that this was created in some way by a loving and powerful God. For me, the natural world is a place that cultivates my wonder. I don't think I've got life figured out, let alone God figured out. So when I spend time in the wilderness and out of the way places, and fortunately where I live, my part of the world, there's a lot of those, I spend a lot of time thinking and wondering. Not only wondering about what life is like in the world, but also wondering what God is like. For me, it's important to talk about making photos rather than taking photos. The word take sounds to me like someone's got a camera and they're just sort of haphazardly, snapping shots everywhere. When I think about making a photograph like this, I'm thinking through my composition. That means where I'm going to put my camera and what's going to be in my frame. And usually for a photograph like this, I want my horizon about 2/3 of the way up or about 2/3 of the way down. And this particular lake, I noticed this interesting, this is a bunch of actually kind of little plants sticking up. Some cattle had grazed it down there. And I like that little mini island out there. And so I decided I want this in my foreground. And then I want to show the colors some way coming off the lake. So I'm making a photograph. As an artist, I'm trying to even pre-visualize what the final product might look like as I think about where I'm going to put my camera, what kind of exposure I'm going to do, and what it might look like at the end. My photographs are, I like to say, my evidence of my co-creating with God. I think God is a creator, but I think God has called us to co-create. Sometimes we do that really poorly. I'm hoping to do that as well as I possibly can as a photographer. I don't think I'm the ultimate creator. I think God is that. But God has called me, and not just me, and in fact, not even just humans. Animals can be co-creators with God. What birds do with nests is sometimes absolutely amazing. Or the beavers that I see, the dams they put in the rivers, very interestingly done. A lot of co-creating is done in creation. God is the creator, but we can work with God. This photograph is one of my favorites because of the experience I had this particular day. This is actually on the Oregon-Idaho border. And I was down in a canyon making photographs. And actually, sometimes it's not all that fun because the light isn't right. And I was like working hard to make a photograph and it wasn't working out. And I'd almost given up and I was kind of leaving. And I came up over and I saw this amazing cloud developing. So I jumped out of my vehicle. I was on this little dirt road back here, and I ran up to this little rise, and I'm trying to think about what's in my foreground, these plants, so I can have this on the top, and it was just overwhelming. I like to say, in that moment, I got my Pentecostal on. I was actually saying out loud, "Hallelujah!" hallelujah. I was just so pumped with this amazing scene in front of me, and I was repositioning my camera, and I just had this feeling of elation. It was a genuine spiritual experience looking at this development, because the longer I took photographs, the more the light changes and the more colors and the more brilliance was there. And just as it was kind of fading and growing dull, off in the distance, the coyotes started yapping at each other, yoo-hoo. At dusk, where I live, the coyotes communicate to find out where they are in relation to one another. And in the ecstasy of the moment, I just sort of threw my head back and I felt like I was, St. Francis of Assisi, preaching to the coyotes out there. But that kind of experience doesn't happen often. But when it does, obviously it's something I don't ever want to forget. And it's a combination of things that make it possible. Part of it is me and my background and how I see the world. Obviously, part of it is something like this, and then in some wild way, the coyotes make it an amazing evening. I don't think of nature as somehow proving that God exists, which, by the way, this is my Scotland photograph. I would like to say I know exactly where I made that photo, but I don't know Scotland well enough. I was driving from St. Andrews to Fort something or other. Fort William, yeah. And I got out and made that particular photo when there was a little bit of clearing. It was raining most of that day. But I don't think of these beautiful creation scenes as somehow proving God's existence. I don't even think of them in terms of proofs. I think they give evidence. I affirm what sometimes is called the theology of nature, which is that nature doesn't prove there is a God, but if you have reasons to think there is a God, you can look at the natural world and find confirmation or find some kind of evidence for that. I sometimes think of nature kind of like a canvas, and the elements and God joining together to make something beautiful. And in that canvas, then I see it, and from my particular perspective, I make some kind of claims about the beauty I see and the God I believe in. This kind of a photograph makes me think about theology. Now, I should say before I go much further that some of the things I'm going to say today, you're probably going to go like, wow, he thinks about God a lot more than I do. And I should say, I'm a trained theologian. I've had that kind of thing in my background. So I not only see the natural world through the lens of believing in God, but also through the lens of a person who's a pastor and a professor. And so some of the insights I want to share today come from that kind of a perspective. The world in which we live, as we all know, is not beautiful all the time. Often it's fairly mundane. But there's some things that I think are actually ugly. Now, there's a certain beauty in this ugliness, but this cow that has been killed and the coyotes have gotten to it, and probably other animals as well, in the midst of a landscape that is odd. I especially like the three rocks up in the background. It almost reminds me of 3 crosses on Calvary. But anyway, when I think about creation, we sometimes only think about what's beautiful and amazing. But there's some harsh realities in the world as well. There are things like fires that make otherwise beautiful places something less than beautiful. Creatures die. And it's in these kind of times when I think about a subject that I've actually written a lot about, and that's the problem of evil. When we think about evil in the world, we sometimes think about what humans do to each other, or maybe what animals do to each other. But there's also some interesting questions about natural fires, like the one that burned up this particular area, or floods, hurricanes, etc. And I think about the animals and snakes that used to live here. This particular photograph was taken in a spot where the year before I was focusing in a different direction, and there was all kinds of plants there. And I heard kind of this thudding, or the plants were moving behind me, and I kind of looked back and didn't see anything, and I went back to my photography. I looked back again, and it's just something weird going on. So I took about 4 steps back, and there were 2 huge bull snakes breeding. I'd never seen snakes having sex before. This was the first time. And it is really interesting what they do. They make a circle and they entwine each other's body around, and they just kind of move in this kind of strange gyration. And I had actually had the wrong lens on my camera at the time, but I'm trying to take photographs of these snakes, and they're just right there, in ecstasy, I suppose. And I'm taking my photographs and thinking, it's these kinds of experiences that are available to me because I actually went out there. I didn't plan to see 2 snakes having sex, something I've never seen before, and I've actually rarely, anyone that I know and most people I know have not seen this. But because I had taken some time to be in a position for something like that to happen, I was able to witness that and make some photographs. I should have put one in so I could have shown you, but I didn't. Sorry. I said that I bring to the world my own particular perspective. And my particular perspective makes a difference in how I see the world. This particular photograph I made last summer. I did a 100-mile loop around Mount Rainier, which is a large mountain in Washington State in the United States. And this was near the end of the trip. I wasn't on the mountain anymore, but I was coming back down to a lower place. And it was a very dark forest, really cool. And as I came down the trail, this little section had this bolt of light coming through. And of course, this is sort of symbolic sometimes in our lives. Sometimes we seem to go through life in the midst of an awful lot of darkness, and we don't know what's going on. And then there's some kind of ray of light. But as I came down the trail, I sort of saw that, and I use this word again, pre-visualized what kind of photograph I might make to somehow describe the feeling I had of coming through the darkness and seeing this light come in. I mention this because I think as some of you are photographers or thinking about going into photography, one of the things you might begin to think about doing is having in your mind's eye the kind of photographs that you would like to make. Sometimes you do that going to a particular place, but other times you're going to an area where you don't know exactly what the terrain is going to be like, but you have in your mind what might occur, what kind of landscape might be there, and then to sort of think about, what do I want to do given the way the clouds are today, given the kind of light that's around me, given the kind of vegetation. About 3 years ago, it was in the middle of winter in Idaho, and I had a Sunday afternoon while my wife was grading, and so I was out doing some hiking, but there was a lot of snow. And it wasn't easy for me to do a long hike, so I was doing a lot of driving, looking for interesting things I might photograph. And I came to an area where there was a lot of fog. The combination of fresh snow and fog meant that you could take photographs that made things appear as if there's nothing behind them but white. So I was taking pictures of fence posts and things and barbed wire and trees and trying to get something that I thought was really cool. And then I came around on this road I shouldn't have been on because I almost got stuck. But I came around the corner and I looked up and saw these black Angus cows grazing in a field. And all the snow on the front and all the mist in the back, it just looked surreal. I probably would not have taken that photograph, even though I was there, if I had not gone out that day thinking, okay, these are the kinds of photographs that I'm probably going to be able to make today. Ones where there's lots of white, because there's lots of snow and lots of fog. But because I had that in mind, when I actually saw this scene, I then could think about what I want to do with my camera. I pre-visualized. I worked from a particular perspective I have in the world. When I say that I like to do photography and think about God, I occasionally have someone say, so you're out there with a camera trying to take pictures of God. And of course I say, I actually think God is invisible. So you can't actually take pictures of God. The way I think about God is the way most Christians do, and that is that God is not available to our five senses. We might have some sort of intuitions about God, but God is an invisible, omnipresent spirit. But one of the things I do try to do is try to make photographs that visually speak of the presence of something that you can't see. Does that make sense at all? In other words, I'm trying to show a picture of something that can't be photographed. And one way to do that is to try to show something that's obscure in some way. So this particular photograph, you probably can't tell, but that's actually a lake water behind it. And I purposely sort of put the trees out of focus and made the sun so that it came through, and it was a little abstract. Or take this next photo. It's not really clear what that is, probably at first glance. But there's something there that almost gives you a feeling of there being something more. And that's my intention, to try to, again, you can't take a picture of God, but is there some way that you can take a picture of the world that might make you wonder, what is that? And is there a reality that can't be quite captured with a camera? What it actually is a stream with some trees in the background, and a few of these are leaves floating in the stream, but most of them are a reflection of this background. But it almost looks like, to me, I was striving to do something like a Monet painting, but obviously not with all the colors that he has. That's an attempt, though, to talk about a way in which God is somehow transcendent. In theology, we sometimes talk about the immanence of God and the transcendence of God. And the transcendence is how God is different from what we see. I also think God is best understood as a spirit. Again, a spirit you can't see, but there are certain things in creation, like clouds, that give us the notion of spirit. That's why in churches sometimes we have smoke. Smoke sometimes gives that. In fact, the next photograph is a photograph I took in the mountains. About a half a mile away, there were some people camping, and their campfire, the smoke had sort of drifted down through the trees. And looking at that, I thought, it kind of, makes me feel like the Holy Spirit, the presence of God, the Shekinah glory, the God who is described as wind or breath or those kinds of notions, in ruach, mind in the Bible. That's the kind of impression I get. So when I'm thinking about the kinds of landscapes that are before me, I'm asking, what about this landscape might in some way be depicted to say something about God? Last summer I took this photograph only about 15 miles from my house. And the landscape isn't that extraordinary. I mean, I guess you might think it's extraordinary because it's a huge valley. But this water was just pummeling down these rocks. And I thought to myself, is there some way that I can sort of try to capture the ethereal notion of a God who can't be captured? And so I hope you can tell this is water coming down, but I opened up my lens and slowed the shutter down. In other words, it was open for a longer period of time, which meant that I got these kind of, they look like spark strikes or something, but it's just the water that's falling through the air. If God can't be seen, some theologians have said God purposely hides. The Latin phrase is Deus abens. I can't speak today. Thank you. Thank you. The word couldn't come out of my mouth. Which basically means the hidden God. And there are some theologians who spend a lot of energy trying to explain why a God who is so powerful and loving wouldn't be just obvious to us all. This particular deer is standing, not even laying down in these bushes. And I thought to myself, this is a nice way to try to describe the hiddenness. Obviously, you can see this particular creature. I don't think you can see God. It's my own personal view that God doesn't purposely hide, that there is something about God that is necessarily hidden because of God being an invisible spirit. Of course, when we think about God, most people think about God's immensity, or at least what theologians call immensity, how absolutely big God is. God's not only here and there, but on other planets and all galaxies and the whole universe. And there's few ways to try to capture the immensity of God better than trying to show the Milky Way. I wonder, Milky Way shots are hard to make if you're anywhere near light. Even in this particular photo, you can see that I've got some light coming in on these clouds, and this is from a town about 20 miles away. So my lens is open here. I've got a really nice lens that I'm using, and I'm opening them up. If you're a photographer, my ISO is on 6400, I think it is, and this is about a 12-second exposure. But I say all that to ask, can you guys see the Milky Way easily here in Leeds, like at night? Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Can you think maybe in Scotland or someplace, if you got far enough away from the light pollution? Yeah, I mean, can you see, I assume you can see stars when it's not cloudy. I was once what's that? Yeah. I was a youth pastor in Southern California in the LA area, and one summer I took a bunch of kids from the city out camping, and I'll never forget, for some reason they're high school kids. We were up at 2. That's why we were up at 2, because they're high school kids. But for the first time, they saw the stars because they'd had so much light pollution in the city, and they were just like blown away. And I think that's, and not even if you're a Christian, but especially if you're a Christian, to be in a kind of a setting where you can see those amazing stars that feel like they're falling right into your lap. You just want to go, awesome, amazing. God is not only making those, but God is present. Theologians call that God's immensity. But to be honest, I actually am more inspired thinking about God in the smaller places. God's activity at the quantum level of reality, at the chemical and biological level. And these kinds of photos that try to pick out something minute, these inspire me to think about how God cares about even the smallest things on our planet, and cares about me and you, which when you look up at the stars, we might seem pretty insignificant. But then when you begin to think about God caring for even these little seeds, it's easier for at least me to believe that God cares for me and what I'm up to. Of course, in Scripture, there's all kinds of references to the power of even a small mustard seed, the power of those who are often forgotten, the least of these. And so when I think about making photographs and think about those kinds of creatures in the world and how the small things can make a difference, I want to, instead of looking at the deep horizon, as I mentioned earlier, think about what's close at hand. What kinds of things are small but contribute to making the world a beautiful place. Now, when I hike, I spend a lot of time in a lot of different places of Idaho, but this terrain is about an hour south of where I live. And this is a place that's called Sucker Creek. Over here, in this kind of valley that you can kind of see is a little stream. And these large cliffs on this side, I'm actually standing on the opposite side of this valley, and there are cliffs right below where I'm standing taking this photo. About 6 years ago, actually about 8 years ago, it was snow all through here and a lot of wind. And I was coming out here to explore. And I came up a little crevice area here that was really difficult hiking. And I was just like so cold. And I had some hot water with me, and I thought, if I can just find a little place in a rock to get away from the wind and get some water, I can warm up. And I looked over, and I saw this little cleft over here in the rock, and I'd never been this part of where I'm hiking, so I thought, I'm going to go check that out and sit in that cleft and drink. Well, I got there, and it was a really cool cave. I call it my cave. It's Tom's cave. I have never seen any other person's footprints other than mine in this cave, so I can legitimately call it my cave. And I sometimes like to go to this cave and just spend some time in reflection. You know, talk about a prayer closet. You're a long way away from anybody else. No one else, I think, knows about this cave. At least I've never seen anybody there or any footsteps. And to spend time in a cave thinking, it's a very nice thing. It makes me think about what God's doing in my life and what I ought to be doing in response. But one particular day, because I was thinking about doing a presentation to you all and to others, I thought maybe I should go to this cave and try to make some photographs to describe the kind of inner workings or inner life of my time in the cave. So I made what I call spiritual selfies. And one of the ways I did it is to try to, because the cave was dark, try to take photos that didn't show my whole self well, because I thought these would somehow depict this life of the mind, this inner kind of meditation or reflection, or the mind of Christ. I'm assuming you can see me in this particular photograph. I'm over on this side. But this is an attempt for me to kind of show me and the cave melding together as I meditate on who God is, who I think God might want me to be, and perhaps more often, to be honest with you, trying to figure out the struggles of my life, trying to make sense of the pain and the confusion and the stuff that I don't think is right in the world. Caves are an important place, and the photography here is trying to depict that. My spirituality, however, is not just about me in a cave. I live in community with other people, and in fact, we're all heirs to a legacy. And to try to portray that legacy, I thought I would take some photos of abandoned homesteads, and this is actually an abandoned schoolhouse in the middle of Idaho. America, we're a young country in terms of European influence, but folks came out into some pretty tough places and eked out a living, eked out a community. In fact, there's places in Idaho, like this particular photo I'm showing you here, that are so far away, the people up and left it, and you can go and just see this place that someone abandoned, I don't know how many years ago. Only if you know how to get there and you're willing to hike a long way and, do all the physical exercise. But when I think about the folks who have come before in Idaho to these remote places, I think about the folks who have come before in the Christian tradition, and those who have made possible the kinds of ideas and opportunities that I have, not only in terms of my own immediate family, but in terms of a much bigger Christian family, and of course not only in terms of the continent that I'm on, North America, but around the world. In North America, however, long before the Europeans came over, we had the native peoples, and there are some really cool, petroglyphs and pictographs in Idaho. This happens to be one of the oldest rocks. It's my favorite rock in this entire state. You can see the detail that the person went through, and it's actually maybe about half as much as big, and it's all just layer upon layers of what people think were shaman trying to peck out designs to portray their spiritual life. I go to parts of the state and try to find these kinds of things and give evidence of those. 8 years ago, I was at this one part of the state where literally the closest person who lives to where I was at was probably 35 miles away. I mean, not even ranchers or farmers, just out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And I found this collection of petroglyphs. And I took this picture, and it was unlike all the other ones I'd taken. I've taken lots and lots of photographs of these petroglyphs, and there's a lot of similarities. The theory is that the shaman actually had a few symbols that they would put wherever they were, and they traveled lots of different places. But I'd never seen a sort of stick figure in a sun. I'm just like, it almost looked like someone was, I don't know, messing around. And so I took this photo, and I went home, and as I was developing it, I thought, I wonder if this is some kind of a solstice spot. If Native peoples in the Americas had some solstice tradition. So I determined that the next June on solstice, I would go out and try to find this. Well, that didn't happen that year. The next year, not until last summer did I finally go out to this place. And I start crawling around and looking, and I ended up getting my body barely down into this crevice. You can see how far down I'm in there. And this was not far from this little spot. And I'm thinking, this is about the only spot that I think it could be. And I sat there and looked around trying to find it. And it took me 5 minutes before I found it. At my feet were these circles that had been etched out. And you can see on this particular day, I was there June 21st, the light, I didn't make it quite at the right time, but you can see the light had just come in toward the middle of that. So I don't know if I'm the first European descent person to find this or not. I registered it with the local archaeology society. But that was pretty cool, pretty thrilling to think about people long before anyone looked like me was thinking about spirituality, at least. I don't know how you think about Native American spirituality, but they were also thinking about the landscape and the great spirits who might be there. So 2 years ago, one of my friends who teaches theology in Chicago at Lutheran Theological Seminary contacted me, and she said, I really care about nature. I talk about God being in the natural world. And whenever I do that, my students think about Yosemite, Yellowstone, these amazing national parks. They don't think about what nature looks like here around them. So would you come for the year and be they have a center there on science and religion called Zygon, our Zygon scholar for the year and our artist in residence, and go around Chicago and show my students there's actually natural beauty here. So, not a bad gig. This is the Chicago skyline from a sort of a pier. This is Lake Michigan one night, and I captured the light coming from the city on the clouds. But there was actually, it was amazing to me how much, if you really looked for it, could be found in the city. This is only a mile or so from the city center. But it was an abandoned area, and these weeds had grown up. And I thought, boy, that's kind of cool. All of this chaos of these natural plants growing up here so close to the city. In the winter time, I spent a lot of time in a place called Washington Park and began to try to think about what nature looks like in winter and how I can somehow photographically describe this in ways that make you think something about God and nature. And I tried to take photographs of birds and animals and whatever I could find. I like this one. I don't know what kind of bird this is. Do we have any big-time birders who know North American birds here? I'm ashamed to say I don't know what it is. But I like the photograph because it depicts well nature in the city. You see the skyscrapers in the background there. But even in Chicago, actually this was just outside the city limits. Well, I think it was technically in the city limits. But even there, in a little nature area, I saw this white-tailed deer one afternoon and thought, wow, that's pretty cool in the midst of all of this. What really got Leah thinking about nature in the city was she was with her 6-year-old son, and they have a plate glass window that goes to their backyard, and they looked out one evening and saw this a possum going across the backyard, 6-year-old son was like, what in the world is that? I've never seen that before. And he got really excited. And she thought, man, she had grown up on a farm and seen lots of things. She said, I've got to have some experiences for my son here in the urban area. And so that kind of launched her into doing this photography thing. One day I'm in Washington Park and I look across the way and I see this movement and there's this possum. So I ran after it and he went up this skinny little tree and looked down at me, and I sent her this picture and she said, yes, a possum in Chicago for my project. I suspect something like this could be taken in Leeds. Do you have lots of ducks in Leeds? Yeah. So, this is just trying to capture the sun coming up one morning, and you've got so much more fog and mist here than we have where I live in Idaho. Good or bad thing, I don't know. But I'll bet something like this, if you were to think about nature here in Leeds, could be possible as God is active in even our urban areas. Let me go back to talking a little bit about some of the thoughts I have about God when moving through the natural landscape. For many people, the first attribute they think of when you say the word God is power, omnipotence, sovereignty. It's no little surprise that when people make movies about God, they call them Bruce Almighty rather than something else. The power of God captures people's attention. And so sometimes I think about the powerful parts of nature. This is actually a waterfall in Yosemite. And there's obviously some amazing things that you can photograph in nature to try to portray incredible sense of power and sovereignty. And I've tried to write about the power of God in a number of different places. And in fact, Simon was instrumental in bringing me here to talk about the problem of evil and a different view of God's power that I've proposed. But I want to be sure to say the natural world is extremely powerful, and of course I think God is extremely powerful. But I have to admit, it's not the power things that inspire me most. It's God's love that really inspires me most. I mean, that's the main reason I believe in God, just to be blunt about it. I spent a short period of my life as an atheist, and it was thinking about the issues of love and trying to make sense of my own intuitions that I ought to be a loving person and other people ought to love me that begin me to wonder if there is something like a God who is the source of love. And so instead of places like this that are incredibly powerful, it's more photographs like this that try to show the tender elements of the world that excite me the most and make me think of God the most. And of course, the mother-child, the mother-duckling relationship is a pretty amazing one. On that trip that I took hiking the distance of Idaho, my 3 daughters individually hiked small sections with me. And the first day that my middle daughter and I were hiking in the mountains, we crossed this stream, and we got across, and she was having a difficult time because it was hard to get across. And we turned around, and there was a little bear cub, just probably 15 feet down the trail from us. And of course, the first thing I think of when I see a cub is, okay, where's Mama? And so, of course, I did what any loving father would do. I put my daughter between me and the bear. And we walked out, Mother Bear stood up, and I took this photo. And there's actually 2 cubs. The one we had seen is a younger one, probably that year's cub. And then this one next to it was probably from the year before. At least it was far bigger. And you don't want to get between a mother bear and her cub. That's just not wise. That's the kind of love that's fierce. That's the kind of love that says, I'm going to protect as best I can no matter what. And the God I believe in is a God who is a nurturing God, a God who cares for us. I spent about 2 hours one morning hanging out with this moose and her calf. This is in Wyoming. She and her calf were there, and I'll let you in on a little secret. I talk to animals, and I find that when I talk to animals, at least from my perspective, they seem to be more open to hanging around. They don't run away, and I don't think they pose for me, but they don't leave. And so as I talked to these guys, they just sort of stood there, and I made a bunch of photographs. And I thought about the amazing trust that they had come, at least from my perspective, they must have had some trust in me that the mother didn't come after me. I think God is a God who is that kind of trust even in us. And we as parents, as friends, as people can model the kind of love that I think God has for us in the world. I grew up on a farm, and on our farm we had two sets of animals. One set of animals were the ones that were ours. Our cows, our pigs, we had a goat. We had rabbits for a short period of time until they all died. We had chickens, and we had horses. I love the horses. And then there was a whole nother set of animals, and those were the enemies. Those were the coyotes, the rattlesnakes, the badgers. And we thought, at least my mind frame was, you tried to kill all the bad animals because you had your good animals. And so when I was young, I shot rabbits, I shot coyotes. I don't know why I shot rabbits because they're not bad, but killed a lot of rattlesnakes, made a lot of hat bands. And then as I started thinking about what it means to be in the world and my relationship to animals, I began to think, I don't really think I need to kill so indiscriminately. Maybe I ought to think differently about the way I relate to animals. And so whenever I would see an animal or bird, instead of, the first thing I tried to do was to say, "Hello, friend," and have some sort of positive response. And it became such a part of me that it was a habit that even without thinking about it, when I would see some new creature, I would say, "Hello, friend." This little guy, he was really great. He posed for a long time. I've got a lot of great photos of him. This is on my screensaver at home. When I turn on my computer, he looks me right in the eye. But he always reminds me of one of my favorite events. You know that rock I showed you earlier of the petroglyphs that are picked out of the rock? I had this, what I thought was a brilliant idea. I was going to go out at night. I was going to have a real dim light going on this, or pointed toward this rock, and then I would have the stars above. And so it'd be really cool. You get the stars, you're in this deep canyon, you could be able to see the petroglyphs and the shadows, and I thought this would be awesome. So I hike out to this place, and I'm setting up my tent, and I look over, and about 150 yards away, there's a young coyote. And he doesn't seem too wary of me, and so I watched him for a little while, and then I forgot about him. And then as things got darker and darker, I went over to set up my really cool photograph, which ended up being a total bust because the clouds came in and I got no stars at all. But anyway, I'm sitting there and I'm sort of getting it all set up, and it's really getting dusk. And all of a sudden I hear a noise. And I turn around, and that coyote was from me to him. He'd walked all the way up, so curious of what I was doing, and I didn't know if he was coming. And the first thing that came out of my mouth as I turned around was, "Hello, friend," because I had habituated this sort of way of relating to others in the wilderness. That was the first thing. And when I turned around, I thought he would scamper off, but he didn't. He sat down on his haunches, took his back leg, scratched his ear like this, and I thought, well, maybe you'll let me photograph you. So I took my camera and went like this, and then he just sort of walked away, and it was too dark to get a photograph. I tell that story because not only to say how I try to relate to animals in my world, but also the power of positive habits. And the way that if over time you begin to do something good and right and develop a particular way of being in the world, it then shapes who you are and how you relate to others. And I think perhaps, I'm not saying that made possible this encounter, but if I had been a person who was always trying to shoot coyotes, I probably would have acted differently earlier in the evening when I saw him in the first place. So I think of animals as friends, even bald eagles. I think of bull elk as possibilities to be friends in my life. Even badgers. Badgers are hard to photograph because once they see you coming, they just go lickety-split toward their hole. This guy, I saw him before he saw me. And so when he turned to run toward his hole, I ran right past him and got between him and his hole. And he was not happy. And when those things are not happy, they make this weird sound and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But it was a great photograph, I thought. So he cooperated, and then I let him go in his hole. I was a friend. Here's a picture I think that you put in your magazine. This was actually a photograph I took in Chicago, or made in Chicago. I probably took 150 photographs of those geese. This was the one that had the joyful, I call it the joyful goose, sort of sticking his neck up in the air. He's really just sort of, I don't know, ruffling his feathers or something, but it just looks to me like he's saying, yeah, I'm living life well. Bighorn rams running through the terrain in Wyoming. These guys, I think there were 8 of them or 9. How many are in the photo? 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 7 in the photo. I think there's a couple more. Oh yeah, there's one head right here. Here's number 8. These guys, a lot of people say, well, how in the world do you get so close to these? And I was using my 8200 zoom, but I didn't have to use it because I got super close. And the only reason I can explain, other than the fact that I was talking with them, is that there were 8 of them and there was just 1 of me. And they looked like they could sort of mess me up if they wanted to. But they eventually trotted away and I made this particular photo. There are growing scientific accounts not only of the similarities between humans and other creatures in terms of our anatomy, our evolutionary history, our genetics, but also in terms of our social interactions and even the possibility of some kind of animal morality, some kind of way in which animals have a code of right and wrong, even amongst especially wolf packs, for instance, or the stuff that a guy named Franz de Waal's doing with bonobos and chimps down in Atlanta. So I think about those kinds of things when I'm in the wilderness. This is the background. There's a Teton Mountains outside of Yellowstone. I was traveling down the road here and I looked out and I saw this moose. You can't really tell it from this picture, but this is actually, there's water here, but there's a river here, and he was out in the snow. And so I waded through the river and got up on the island with him to take this photograph. And he got up and turned around. I made this photo. And then I thought, what would be super cool is if I got back in the water and then got a reflection of him looking at me. And I made that photo. It didn't turn out quite the way I wanted to, but it was cold, super cold. And then he trotted off the island, and instead of going the direction you see in this photograph, which would have been easy for him, he decided to cross the river. And it was really strange. He couldn't make it. He got it about halfway across and then came back, and then maybe went another 100 yards downstream and then made it across. And so I learned something about moose that day, that they actually don't necessarily want to cross the rivers that are too deep even for them. This is a golden eagle. I think this golden eagle must have got into some poison or something. Other birds were dive bombing him. So I went over and started making photographs, and he would kind of run away from me, and I thought maybe he busted his wing at first because he wouldn't fly, and that wing kind of looks weird. But after about 15 minutes of me walking with him and taking photos, he kind of got up to a higher level and then turned back the way we'd come, and then started running and flapped his wings and just barely got off the ground and made it up into a tree. But boy, up close, those things are majestic, amazing birds. I'm telling animal stories now. I'm sorry if I'm getting into this, but I got to tell another one. I was in the Sequoias 2 years ago at a science and religion event, and a friend and I named Carl Giberson decided we were going to go out and have a walk. And he's a city guy, and He wanted to get out and see what the Sequoia National Park was. So we went out, and I looked across the field, and I saw this bear turning over rocks looking for bugs to eat. And I just had the camera I actually have today, my little Canon point and shoot with me. But of course I wanted a picture of this bear. So I just ran across the valley toward this bear, and I got probably 70 yards, and he saw me, and he started running away from me. So then I'm trying to catch up to get this photograph, and he goes up this tree, and he just sort of stands there and looks down at me like, yeah, come up and get me here. So I took the photo, and whenever I see that, I think of my wife saying I'm not always very smart, but I got a good photo out of it. Animals can do awesome stuff. We call these snow geese. It looks like they can walk on water. They have to get a good run to get going, and then once they get up, they're really cool. I believe that animals have intrinsic value, which means that they have value in and for themselves, not just for what they can do for us. Now, I think we can also benefit from animals in some ways, but we should also respect the value that they have for themselves. A few more animal photos. I think God loves all animals, including rattlesnakes, like this particular guy. I have a particular fondness for snakes, so I have a lot of snake photos. But every once in a while, something majestic happens, like this blue heron taking flight off what's called the Snake River. As I tried to think about a photograph that might portray an important value for me, an important value theologically, I wanted to find something that would talk about the interrelatedness of existence. I believe God is related to us and we relate to God, and that existence relates to one another. And I begin to hear about this particular aspen grove in Utah. This is apparently, actually I've got it written down, so let me say it correctly. It's the determined to be a single living organism by identical genetic markers and assumed to have one massive underground root system occupying 106 acres and the heaviest known organism in the world. The root system of this thing that they call Pando is an estimated 80,000 years old and among the oldest living organisms. I think they listed as the oldest until they found some sort of what are mushrooms? What are they? Fungus. Yeah, fungus, I think, in Oregon that they think is older now. But it's still thought to be the heaviest single organism with the same genetic markers. Of course, I think that's part of the truth of the idea of interrelatedness. In an interrelated world, if we use those relations properly, we can thrive. We can blossom. We can become more than we could ever become as individuals. And so to try to depict that visually, I made this photo. Just to talk a little bit about the decision I made in the photo, notice that this particular tree here is out of focus. If I had focused in on this one and the back were there, you would probably think more in terms of a few and then a bunch in the background. But I thought, if I focus further back, your eye would go here, and then you would kind of almost feel like you're in the middle of them. So something to think about photographically. What kind of impression do you want to make with your photo? My attempt here was to give you the impression that you could somehow be in the midst of them. And the way to do that is to focus here instead of here to make that possible. I'm sure there's some other things you could do as well. Okay, sometimes people will say to me, Tom, what's your favorite photograph? And that's like asking a father, what's your favorite kid? You can't do that. But if there's a particular type of photograph that I like best, it's this one here. This gets at what I was trying to describe earlier. There's so many elements here. There's this sense of lack of order and chaos, but also the way I've composed it, it's not so chaotic as to make no sense at all. There's definitely darkness, there's scraggly stuff, but there's some amazing clouds at the top, there's some light coming through. I'd like to think of myself as a realist. And that is, I don't think of the world as all good. I also don't think of it as all evil. And maybe that's part of why I like this photograph. It seems to me there's positive and negative elements in this. And I always get a little skeptical if someone says everything's all right in the world, because I think there's a lot of crappy things in the world. But I'm also not convinced by people who see the world always as horrible. And maybe that's part of the reason why I'm attracted to making this kind of a photograph. Idaho has 6 wild horse herds. And if you know where to go and you're patient, you can get out there and hang out with these horses. I think God is wild. And so when I think of wild horses, I think about a God who is wild. I think it was the Scot who then became an American, John Muir, who says, "In God's wildness is the hope of the world." I love that line. John Muir, the great environmentalist, was so instrumental in setting aside wilderness areas in the United States, especially Yosemite. But I also think when I think of wild horses like this or like these that I photographed, I think of a line from the Chronicles of Narnia, in which, those of you who've seen this, Aslan is sort of the God figure in the story. And one of the characters, I think it's Peter, says, "He's not tame, but he is good." I like that. They're not tame, but they are good. Horses make me think of that. These things are so intelligent. It just, I was fortunate enough to grow up on a farm and be around horses and other animals, and they're just amazing what they can do. Now, in the wild, they do some really interesting things I've never seen them do on the farm. And one of them is when they're in a large herd like this previous thing. These guys were just about ready to do this. When I come up to photograph them, I'm usually talking, because they're far enough away, I don't whisper. I'm just sort of talking out loud and giving them, going slow. And they get kind of nervous, and they'll turn their body sideways, and then they'll face me like this, and they'll start trotting toward me, like they're intimidating me. And I assume that what happens if a coyote is in that position, they turn and run, but I just sort of stand there, and they'll come, not super close, but the first time it happened, I was like kind of freaking out. Are they going to run me over? But they'll come close, and then the first one will veer off to the side, and they'll trot away at a distance and then stop, and then I'll talk to them and walk. So they're curious about me. They have certain ways of trying to test me. The wildness comes out in powerful ways. Of course, if you talk to photographers, one of the first things they will say to you is, it's the light that matters most. And I think that's true. In terms of theology, of course, that brings in all kinds of interesting dimensions. Jesus says he's the light of the world, for instance. There's all kinds of references to light. But there's also references to a kind of world in which there's both order and chaos. This is a photograph I made in California in the Sierra Mountains. Anybody ever heard of the John Muir Trail? Yeah. I hiked the John Muir Trail 2 summers ago and made this particular photo one evening. When folks talk about God and nature, sometimes they'll talk about extraordinary natural occurrences. And that might be the damage of a hurricane, or it might be last summer's eclipse, total eclipse in the United States. I hiked out to a remote area to take this particular photo. These kinds of strange things make a lot of people talk about God. Not always in ways I like, but for some reason, the oddity of a natural occurrence, as people try to explain it, the spiritual and religious dimensions start to poke their head through. More commonly is the idea that we see God through sort of what we call the God rays. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, but the idea when the sun is shining through the clouds and you can see those beams. This is actually another photo near Yellowstone. Those are the Teton Mountains. This is a photograph I made just about a month ago. And I put it in this collection to emphasize again this notion of light. That as a photographer, you're looking for contrast. And I initially started trying to take photographs of these thistle things, and I was doing those for a few minutes until I started noticing these, and I don't even know what they are. But notice in my choice in this particular photograph, I decided to focus in on this one here and make your eye go there first, and then see that in context of the other elements there. But it's another way of thinking about the particular light and how to make sense of a photograph through light. And of course, not just Christianity, but many religious traditions talk about becoming enlightened. And I think there's something about that, because the light in some way reveals things you don't always see. This is a photograph I made on the Oregon coast. And after I made it, I thought, I need to go to Iceland, because this seems like the photographs I see other people make in Iceland. Got to get up there sometime. Enlightened, of course, doesn't mean that I understand God fully. Again, I think I see as if looking through a glass darkly, to use the King James version of Corinthians. But I want to conclude, before we go to conclude this part of the presentation and go to more Q&A, by sort of repeating my main theme that I hope I've gotten across this afternoon. And that is spending time in nature, looking at the natural world, can be a way to think about God and God's relationship with us and our lives. We can ponder God, we might say. I like to think that it's only when I understand the world to be filled with awe that I can understand it to be awesome. Or in terms of God, if I have a spirit of wonder, it's more likely that I'll see the world and God as wonderful. The way that I present myself to the world makes a difference in how I see it and how the world seems to shape me. Well, let me conclude with just a few thoughts. Hopefully something I've said today is helpful in some way, either helpful in terms of just the mechanics of how you think about hiking and photography, perhaps inspirational. My hope would be that you might want to spend more time outside enjoying nature and thinking about God, perhaps even taking your camera and trying some new things. Maybe you've got some ideas. That's what I do. I look at other people's photographs and try to steal ideas and say, oh, that's great. I wonder if I could do something similar. Hopefully something about this afternoon has been helpful in some way. But I want to close by just thanking you for spending a little time talking about things that I care about and apparently you care about too. So thanks for coming out.
I think we'd like to say a really big thank you. You've taken us a tour of a wonderful world and you've shown us how you've seen it, and we've been absolutely delighted. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast from the Leeds Church Institute. If you would like to keep up to date with news and events from the Leeds Church Institute, please visit lcileeds.org. The LCI library is open weekdays between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. It's a great place to relax, think and read. We stock books ranging from classic theology to the latest explorations of faith, spirituality and contemporary culture. There's also a range of magazines which is updated regularly. If you can't make it into the office, that's no problem. If you're a member and would like to borrow a book, we can post it to you free of charge and provide a free post envelope for you to return it to us. We want to make reading and reflection as easy as possible. If there's a book you would like to read, give the office a ring on 0113 245 4700 to see if we have it. If we don't, we may be able to order it in and add it to the library so others can benefit from your suggestion as well. Find out more at lcileeds.org.